Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our second read in Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is entitled Racial Facts and Fallacies, and the section we're going to be reading is entitled Economics. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we will be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about all of this. This read is broken up into several subsections, so I'll let you know when we get to those subsections, and I'll also put a timestamp in this video's description for all of those breaks so you guys can follow along easier that way. So without further ado, let's dive on into tonight's read, which is in Chapter 6, Racial Facts and Fallacies. Economics. Gross income differences between groups can easily lead to fallacious conclusions if various demographic, educational, and other differences are ignored. Unfortunately, many racial comparisons are like comparisons of apples and oranges, since races differ in many ways besides race. They differ not only in age and family size, but also in education and in the proportion of their respective populations that are working, among other differences. As with comparisons of women and men, comparing truly comparable individuals of different races often produces very different results from gross intergroup comparisons. Gross comparisons of racial and ethnic groups are only a starting point in the process of trying to understand the factors at work in producing differences in incomes and occupations at a given time, as well as changes over time. The U.S. Census in 2000 showed that the median earnings of blacks were $27,264 in 1999, compared to a national average of $32,098, so that blacks as individuals earned 85% of what Americans in general earned. As families, however, blacks earned only 66% of the national average for families. That is because the average black family has fewer people than American families in general, since a higher proportion of black families lack fathers. When comparing black married couples with other married couples, however, blacks earned 88% of the national average for married couples, $50,690, compared to a national average of $57,345. Among Asian Americans, the 2000 census showed that their median individual earnings exceeded the national average, $40,650 for Asian American men, compared to $37,057 for all American men. As individuals, Asian Americans earn 10% more than the national average. As families, they earn 19% more, $59,324, compared to a national average of $50,046. Part of this is due to the fact that Asian American families tend to include fathers more often than the families of Americans in general. With Asian Americans, as with blacks, their incomes have not always been as high, relative to the national average, as today. With both, assessing the role of racial discrimination involves a consideration of history as well as economics. For perspective, we also need to consider racial and ethnic groups in other countries. In Malaysia, for example, the Malay majority averaged less than half the income of the Chinese minority throughout the last quarter of the 20th century, even though the Chinese were in no position to discriminate against the Malays. And in fact, there were widespread government programs giving preferential treatment to Malays. In Sri Lanka, the Tamil minority likewise had higher incomes than the country's majority population, the Sinhalese, until laws and policies severely discriminating against the Tamils beginning in the 1950s, enabled the Sinhalese to overtake the Tamils in income by 1973. In general, discrimination must take its place among the various other factors behind intergroup economic differences. How much of a factor can vary from group to group, from country to country, and from one time period to another. Employment discrimination. Discrimination is one of those words that is often used and seldom defined. Bias, prejudice, and discrimination are often lumped together as if they were pretty much the same thing. But bias and prejudice are attitudes, things inside people's heads, while discrimination is an overt act taking place outside in the real world. That is not a small distinction when analyzing economic differences, which are things visible in the real world. Nor can we simply assume that more bias or prejudice translates automatically into more discrimination, or that discrimination would not exist in the absence of bias or prejudice. What is overlooked in such fallacious assumptions is the price that has to be paid by someone who turns his subjective feelings into an overt act. Imagine someone who owns a golf course in a country where racial discrimination is perfectly legal, and that this owner has a bias or prejudice against blacks. With an international tournament scheduled to be played at this golf course, would the owner pay no price for excluding Tiger Woods? The price to be paid would probably run into the millions, because the absence of Tiger Woods would reduce the worldwide television audience on which advertising rates and revenues are based, thereby reducing how much television networks would pay the owner of the golf course to broadcast the tournament. While it is easy to visualize the cost of discrimination, in an example like this, there is usually a cost to be paid by anyone who competes in the marketplace in other situations. Employers who discriminate against job applicants from particular groups usually have to pay either more in order to attract additional workers from other groups to take their place, or else lower the job qualifications required in order to make more of the existing job applicants eligible. Either way, that costs money, whether in higher pay or in lower productivity from less qualified workers. If the discriminating employer is competing with other producers of similar products, then those competitors who have either less racial partiality or who care more about money can hire more qualified workers from the rejected groups without having to pay the additional costs paid by the employer who rejected them. In a competitive market, these cost differences translate into differences in profit rates and can even translate into a difference between survival and bankruptcy. Do the costs of discrimination actually change behavior in the real world? Hard evidence indicates that it does. Even in South Africa during the era of white rule and official racial apartheid policies that limited or forbade the employment of blacks in particular jobs or industries, white employers in competitive industries often hired blacks in greater numbers or in higher occupations than the law allowed. A South African government crackdown in a construction industry alone led to fines imposed on hundreds of companies for such violations of the apartheid laws. There is no reason to suppose that these employers had less racial bias or prejudice than the politicians who passed the apartheid laws. The difference was that passing such laws cost politicians nothing, but discrimination against blacks cost competitive businesses money. Similar economic principles apply when landlords discriminate against certain groups who want to become tenants, or when lenders discriminate against members of such groups who wish to borrow. This is not to say that no discrimination ever takes place. For one thing, all economic transactions need to take place in competitive industries or in profit-seeking enterprises. Before racial discrimination became illegal and socially unacceptable in the United States, nonprofit organizations like universities, foundations, and hospitals could discriminate more readily and against more groups because their survival did not depend on making a profit, and the implicit costs of their decisions were paid out of the endowments and donations supplied by others. Similarly, government enterprises around the world have tended to be more discriminatory because their costs of discrimination are paid by the taxpayers rather than by those who do the discriminating. In some eras, this discrimination has been against minorities, but in other eras, there has been quote-unquote reverse discrimination against members of the majority, which is often phrased politically as quote-unquote preferences for members of selected minorities. As noted in Chapter 4, universities which seldom, if ever, hired black professors before the 1960s began the preferential hiring of black professors afterwards. Similarly, with the employment practices of hospitals, foundations, government agencies, and regulated public utilities, all of whom are cushioned in one way or another from the economic pressures of competition. Neither discrimination nor reverse discrimination costs them what such practices cost profit-based businesses in competitive industries. Just as people with racial bias or prejudice may fail to discriminate when the cost of doing so is too high, someone with no racial antipathy at all may still discriminate by race if rates of crime, disease, or other undesirable characteristics differ from one racial group to another, and alternative ways of sorting out individuals are more costly or less accurate. Indeed, members of the same group may discriminate against other people like themselves for this reason, as when black taxi drivers avoid picking up black male passengers after dark. In short, race is used as a sorting device for decision-making even by people who are not racists. Thus, employers may be reluctant to hire young black males because these employers are aware of what a high proportion of them may have been arrested or imprisoned, even if these employers have no antipathy to black people as such and readily hire older blacks or black females. A study of those employers who routinely check for prison records among all people who apply for employment found that these particular employers hired black males more often than other employers did. That is, these particular employers no longer had to rely on using race as a sorting device when they already had in place a more accurate and more costly sorting device that was in use for screening their job applicants in general. Distinguishing racism as such from the use of race as a sorting device complicates the problem of trying to determine how much racial discrimination exists. It is also worth noting that one of the things that makes race such a widely used sorting device is that it is far less costly than other sorting devices, since race is immediately visible to the naked eye at no cost, unlike religion, education, or other sorting devices that require more time, effort, or expense. Many people have said that each person should be judged as an individual, but virtually no one actually does that because the cost of acquiring sufficient knowledge about an individual is often far more than it is worth. Such costs can include not only financial costs, but also physical dangers, including death. When you see a shadowy figure in an alley at night that might be a kindly neighbor out walking his dog or a sadistic serial killer waiting to ambush another victim, it is not worth the cost of finding out which. In general, how finely it pays to sort depends on the costs and benefits of doing so. At one time, employment advertisements said, quote, "No Irish need apply," end quote. Such ads did not begin to disappear until the acculturation of Irish immigrants to the norms of American society reached the point where the benefits of sorting the Irish individually exceeded the costs of doing so. With racial or ethnic minorities, as with women, the question of discrimination is not simply whether there is any or how much, but also where it takes place. In both cases, the discrimination can begin in childhood, especially when it comes to schooling, so that there may be real differences in qualifications by the time individuals begin entering the job market as adults. For many years, indeed generations, black children in the South attended schools where the expenditures per pupil were substantially lower than in white schools. In some parts of the South, per pupil expenditure was several times as high for white students as for black students. In some places, the number of days in a school year differed, so that black and white students with the same number of years of schooling had very different quantities and qualities of education. When, in adulthood, Blacks and whites with the quote-unquote same education were paid different amounts during the Jim Crow era. It was by no means certain whether the difference represented employer discrimination or discrimination that occurred before the worker reached the employer, or some combination. In a later era, after such disparities in per-pupil expenditures and in days of school attendance were either less or non-existent, the academic performances of the students themselves differed so much that, as already noted, an average black 17-year-old scored at a low level achieved by white students who were years younger. Here again, though for different reasons, comparisons of the incomes of blacks and whites with the quote-unquote same education were comparisons of apples and oranges, so that inferences of employer discrimination were still questionable. Among the economic questions that can be raised about discrimination are: how much of it there is at a given time and place, how much has it changed over time, and how much of the economic differences between groups can be explained by it. One way to assess the last is by comparing truly comparable individuals from different racial or ethnic groups. Simple as that might seem in principle, it is not always easy in practice. Often the best we can do is to observe how gross differences between groups narrow when comparing individuals from those groups who are comparable in some important respects. As far back as 1980, college-educated black married couples earned slightly more than white college-educated married couples. As far back as 1969, young black males whose homes included newspapers, magazines, and library cards, and who had also gone on to obtain the same number of years of schooling as young white males, had the same incomes as their white counterparts. This had not always been true. In earlier periods, such cultural factors had little weight, suggesting that racial discrimination had more weight in earlier times. By 1989, blacks, whites, and Hispanics in the United States of the same age, 29, and with the same IQ, 100, all had annual incomes within $1,000 of one another when they worked year-round. Seldom, if ever, do employers ask job applicants whether they come from homes with newspapers, magazines, and library cards. Nor are they likely to give job applicants IQ tests. Moreover, even if they did these unlikely things, employers who are racist are unlikely to care when the applicant is black or belongs to some other racial or ethnic group that the employer does not like. The fact that researchers today find such factors shrinking the racial difference in income to the vanishing point among comparable individuals suggests that racial discrimination by employers explains relatively little of the still large income differences between blacks and whites. In short, these racial income differences are not between individuals who are comparable on cultural variables, but reflect the fact that these variables are themselves different between the races. Comparisons of comparable people can even reverse the conclusions suggested by gross statistics. Quote, "A number of economists and sociologists investigating discrimination in a labor market have recently concluded that this is the principal reason why blacks don't have average incomes that are as high as those of whites. What looks like discrimination, this body of research suggests, is better described as rewarding workers with stronger cognitive skills. Thus, a study of men 26 to 33 years old who held full-time jobs in 1991 found that when education was measured in the traditional way, years of school completed, blacks earned 19% less than comparably educated whites. But when the yardstick was how well they performed on basic tests of word knowledge, paragraph comprehension, arithmetical reasoning, and mathematical knowledge, the results were reversed. Black men earned 9% more than white men with the same education, as defined by skill." End quote. Even where race, as such, is not used as a sorting device, other sorting devices can have different impacts on people of different races. For example, to disqualify job applicants who have been convicted felons may disqualify a larger percentage of one group than another. Even to disqualify individuals who have tattoos or strange names can likewise affect a larger percentage of one group than another. Anti-discrimination laws make employers liable to legal action for policies or practices which have a quote-unquote disparate impact on different groups. The burden of proof falls on the accused in these cases to demonstrate the validity of the particular criteria used. This reversal of the usual legal principle of putting the burden of proof on the accuser is often enough to predetermine the outcome, since the cost of proving effectiveness to the satisfaction of third parties with no experience can easily exceed the value of whatever is at issue in a lawsuit. For example, it can cost tens of thousands of dollars just to validate a mental test, with no guarantee that it will be validated to the satisfaction of third parties who are unlikely to be experts on mental tests, statistical analysis, or the industry involved. Such cases are often settled out of court by employers aware of the futility of trying to prove their innocence, even when they have not discriminated. Consumer discrimination. Employment discrimination is not the only kind of discrimination. There have been many allegations that businesses in ghetto neighborhoods charge higher prices or offer inferior goods and services, and that banks and other lending institutions discriminate against black applicants for loans, while check cashing agencies charge unjustifiably high prices for performing a service that banks perform free of charge or for their middle-class customers. Data in support of such charges need to be scrutinized, like other data that seem convincing on the surface, but only on the surface. There is little question that the prices charged by stores in low-income neighborhoods tend to be higher than prices charged by stores in middle-class neighborhoods. Moreover, the quality of perishable items like meat, fruits, and vegetables may also be lower, and there have been many complaints that the quality of service is not as high in low-income neighborhoods. Many who have studied such things in racial ghettos conclude that this shows quote-unquote exploitation of consumers or racial discrimination or both. An alternative economic explanation is that it costs more to operate stores in ghetto neighborhoods, and that such costs are passed on to the consumers there. To the extent that higher costs cannot be fully passed on to the consumers, ghetto businesses would tend to be less profitable, and so such neighborhoods would attract fewer businesses in general. Moreover, the kinds of businesses they do attract are often businesses that would find it difficult to survive the competition in middle-class neighborhoods, whether because of lower efficiency or less courteous service. While both the racism and exploitation theory and the economic theory are consistent with the observed differences between ghetto businesses and businesses in middle-class neighborhoods, there are empirical data which can test these theories against one another. First, it would need to be established that there are in fact differences in the cost of doing business in these different neighborhoods and what those differences are. As already noted in Chapter 2, the cost of delivering merchandise to stores is lower when a given amount of merchandise is delivered to one giant supermarket or big box store like Walmart or Costco than to a large number of smaller stores scattered around town. Moreover, insofar as stores in ghetto neighborhoods face higher costs due to higher rates of shoplifting, vandalism, crime, or violence, these costs are reflected in merchandise losses, repair costs, insurance costs, and costs of preventative devices like iron grates or security guards. While higher prices charged to consumers recapture some of those costs, they may not capture all. A higher proportion of low-income consumers shop outside their own neighborhoods than is the case with middle-class customers, no doubt because some low-income consumers try to escape the higher prices charged locally in their neighborhood. Therefore, the ability of stores within ghetto neighborhoods to recover all their extra costs by raising prices is limited by the prospect that even more of their customers will shop elsewhere if they raise their prices further. That in turn means that their profit rates are limited more so than that of stores in middle-class neighborhoods. A study of stores in low-income neighborhoods in Washington found that indeed prices were higher, but that profit rates were not higher in these neighborhoods. This might also explain the absence of many stores, and especially stores belonging to large supermarket chains in ghetto neighborhoods. Ghetto stores may in fact be struggling to survive while being accused of quote-unquote exploitation and quote-unquote greed. It should also be noted that most people are not criminals even in high-crime neighborhoods, but that those who are not pay the price in many ways for those among them who are. Yet the high prices they pay in stores are seldom attributed to the criminals who cause these high prices, but are instead more likely to be attributed to the shopkeepers who charge these prices. This particular fallacy is especially likely if the store owner is from a different racial or ethnic group. Moreover, where there are local politicians and community activists who are quick to denounce the police for taking forceful actions against criminals or rioters, the police tend to become less vigorous in enforcing the laws in these neighborhoods in order to protect their own careers, so that criminal elements have a freer hand, again at the expense of the local residents, both economically and otherwise. It should also be noted that ghetto neighborhoods have not always been places largely deprived of stores and other businesses, providing both services and jobs. In earlier eras, when crime rates were lower, and especially before the massive ghetto riots of the 1960s, there were many businesses operating in black communities that no longer do so, as noted in Chapter 2. That is also part of the large and lasting prices paid by ghetto residents. An additional factor today is that in those few cases where low-price, big-box stores like Walmart are considering located in or near cities with large minority populations, they are often thwarted by the political opposition of labor unions, reinforced by allies they recruit by denouncing the non-union and other policies of such stores. These allies often consider themselves friends of minorities, one of the many fallacies about race. Lending discrimination. Statistical differences between acceptance rates for black and white applicants for loans from financial institutions have been cited as bases for claims of racial discrimination. A nationwide study of mortgage lending statistics for 1990, published by the Federal Reserve Board in 1991, showed differences among various racial groups in the proportion of mortgage loan applications accepted and rejected. Most black, white, Hispanic, and Asian applicants had their applications approved, but the percentage denied conventional mortgage loans ranged widely from 34% for blacks to 13% for Asian Americans. Although the study warned that it had no data on the applicant's net worth, credit history, employment history, and other factors normally weighed in decisions to grant or deny mortgage loan applications, there were immediate claims that the study showed racial discrimination. Jesse Jackson called it quote-unquote criminal activity that banks, quote, routinely and systematically discriminate against African Americans and Latinos in making mortgage loans, end quote. A similar Federal Reserve Board study with similar results, published the following year, led to similar conclusions. The Washington Post, for example, reported that there was, quote, overwhelming evidence, end quote, of discrimination in, quote, our banking system, end quote. Comments on both studies focused on differences between blacks and whites, and sometimes Hispanics as well. But the statistics in these studies also included data on Asian Americans, and these later data were almost invariably ignored. In both the 1991 study and the 1992 study, whites were denied conventional home mortgage loans more often than Asian Americans. The same reasoning that led to the conclusion that blacks were being discriminated against in favor of whites would lead to the very questionable conclusion that whites were being discriminated against in favor of Asian Americans. But however questionable that conclusion, we cannot simply accept empirical evidence when it supports our preconceptions and reject that same evidence when it goes against those preconceptions. That would be adding to the many fallacies already surrounding race. A later study showed that Asian Americans took out expensive subprime loans less frequently than whites did, but again, the media focus was on black-white differences in the use of costly subprime loans, And again, the conclusion was that racial discrimination in access to conventional loans explained the differences. Here, as with claims of job discrimination and consumer discrimination, gross statistics need to be scrutinized to ensure that the comparisons being made are not comparisons of apples and oranges. Although the data on mortgage loan applications in the Federal Reserve studies did not include their net worth, for example, other data on blacks and whites in general showed very large differences in net worth even when differences in income are controlled. So to say, as many did, that blacks and whites with the same income were turned down at different rates is not to say that individuals of equal credit standing were turned down at different rates, since net worth is a weighty consideration in the granting or denial of mortgage loans. According to an earlier survey, quote, the average white household held roughly 4 times the amount of liquid assets as the average black household, end quote. This was only one of the ways in which the comparisons being made were comparisons of apples and oranges. A 1992 study of mortgage lending in Boston by the Boston Federal Reserve Bank showed that black, white, and Hispanic applicants were not the same on a number of relevant factors. Quote, as reported in other surveys, black and Hispanic applicants have considerably less net wealth and liquid assets than whites. Black and Hispanic applicants also tend to have poorer credit histories than whites. Blacks and Hispanics in Boston are substantially more likely than whites to be purchasing a 2 to 4 family home. The higher proportion of 2 to 4 family homes among denied applicants, for whites as well as for blacks and Hispanics, suggests that lenders perceive more risk associated with financing the purchase of such properties. End quote. One reflection of these and other differences is that different proportions of the various groups applied for conventional mortgage loans as distinguished from government-backed mortgage loans. The government-backed loans tend to be easier to qualify for and also tend to have lower restrictions on the size of the loans that are available, thereby limiting how expensive a house could be bought by someone without sufficient assets to supplement the mortgage loan. Blacks' applications for government-backed loans were 85% as numerous as their applications for conventional loans, while whites applied for government-backed loans only 32% as often as they applied for conventional loans, and Asians applied for government-backed loans only 11% as often as for conventional loans. On virtually every variable for which there are data, the groups differ markedly. For example, whites applied for loans to refinance their home more often than they applied for loans for home improvement, while with blacks it was just the reverse. Yet, here as in other cases, statistical disparities are readily taken as proof of racial discrimination, as if race is the only difference among the people being compared. Moreover, the omission of Asian Americans suggests that discordant data are being avoided rather than being allowed to raise embarrassing questions about the whole approach of drawing implications from statistical disparities. This is not the only situation where statistical and other facts about Asian Americans are avoided when such facts could undermine the prevailing and convenient explanation of racial differences. The study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston sought to control statistically for various factors in order to determine what unexplained residual differences would remain after comparing blacks and whites with the same measured characteristics. The conclusion reached was that while blacks with the same measured characteristics as whites were turned down 17% of the time, they should have been turned down just 11% of the time if the same criteria were used. However, instead of a plain statement of a 6 percentage point unexplained differential, the conclusion was expressed quite differently. Quote, a black or Hispanic applicant in the Boston area is roughly 60% more likely to be denied a mortgage loan than a similarly situated white applicant. This means that 17% of black or Hispanic applicants instead of 11% would be denied loans even if they had the same obligation ratios, credit history, loan-to-value, and property characteristics as white applicants. In short, the results indicate that a serious problem exists in the market for mortgage loans, and lenders, community groups, and regulators must work together to ensure that minorities are treated fairly. End quote. Thus, a 6 percentage point unexplained differential was presented as a 60% greater chance of being denied a loan, since 17% is roughly 60% larger than 11%. But the problems of the Boston Federal Reserve study go beyond tendentious semantics. Like so many studies which hold particular variables constant, this one seemed to assume that either these were the only variables that mattered, or that any other variables could be assumed to be the same as between blacks and whites, even though every variable actually investigated had turned out to be different between blacks and whites. Finally, when the records of specific banks were examined by others, it turned out that all the remaining difference in loan approval rates for comparable blacks and whites were due to just one bank. And that bank was owned by blacks. If the lending discrimination theory were correct, it would mean that blacks had to have higher credit worthiness than whites in order to have their loans approved. That in turn would imply that subsequent default rates among black borrowers would be lower than among white borrowers. But empirical evidence from census data did not suggest a racial difference in default rates among the approved borrowers. A writer for Forbes magazine explained the implications of this fact to the principal author of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank study, Alicia Monell. When pressed, she agreed with his point that, quote, discrimination against blacks should show up in lower, not equal, default rates. Discrimination would mean that good black applicants are being unfairly rejected, end quote. But she calls this, quote, a sophisticated point, end quote, and this discussion followed. Quote, this is a discussion between Forbes and Monell. Forbes, did you ever ask the question that if defaults appeared to be more or less the same among blacks and whites, that points to mortgage lenders making rational decisions? Monell, no. Monell does not want to repudiate her study. She tells Forbes, on reflection, that the census data are not good enough and could be, quote unquote, massaged further. Quote, I do believe that discrimination occurs, end quote. Forbes, you have no evidence? Monell, I do not have evidence. No one has evidence, end quote. Even if there were no data on factors that affect mortgage lending, the mortgage lending discrimination charge would have a hard time passing the plausibility test. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that every mortgage loan officer in every bank and every savings and loan association is white and that every one of them dislikes black people. What follows from that? The mortgage loan officer is going to have to deal with black mortgage loan applicants, whether their loan applications are approved or disapproved, and these black applicants will probably never be seen again by anyone at the bank, whether their applications are approved or disapproved. Moreover, for neither black nor white applicants is approval a question of doing someone a favor. It is a question of making money from them. Does dislike of black people mean dislike of receiving their mortgage payments checks in the mail each month? Even in the worst years of racism in the Jim Crow South, very few white people refused to accept money in the mail from blacks. During the period of the earlier study alleging mortgage loan discrimination, banks and savings and loan associations were struggling to avoid going bankrupt, and many lost that struggle. To believe that they were turning down qualified blacks whose checks in the mail could have saved their hides is to believe that the mere knowledge that the checks coming in from people they never saw were from black people would have been enough for these bank officials to cut their own throats financially. As for subprime lenders who charge higher interest rates to people with lower credit ratings, many, if not most, have had heavy losses in the millions of dollars. In 2001, the Bank of America abruptly shut down its subprime lending program after losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Some subprime lenders have gone bankrupt, all the while being widely denounced for unconscionably exploiting the poor, when what they have done, in fact, has been to underestimate how risky the loans were that they were making, so that even the higher interest rates they charged were not enough to cover those risks. That concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and the review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So this part of this read within this chapter is really not much more than just a debunking of common claims of discrimination that we see throughout the greater heading usually of systemic discrimination. So in this case, the logical follow-up to a claim of there being a systemic discrimination, or that the society in the U.S., if you will, is in great respect racist in some way. Well, what you would do is you'd say, well, name the system and name how it's racist. So in this case, he's coming up with these systems that have been claimed to be racist, and he's showing that in short, that if you perform the independent variable control, that the dependent variable of discrimination can't possibly account for the final result. So in short, if you perform the independent variable control, the results wind up being different. Sowell points this out on page 180. Yet here, as in other cases, statistical disparities are readily taken as proof of racial discrimination, as if race is the only difference among the people being compared. Excuse me, while I stumble through that part of the read. So there's two things to come out of this. Number one, if there is a disparity, that doesn't necessarily mean racial discrimination of some kind. If you want to follow the science and follow the scientific method, one of the most important aspects of the scientific method is the establishment of independent variable control. So if you control for all of these independent variables, what you might find is that discrimination based on race couldn't possibly, or animus causing a discrimination based on race, couldn't possibly account for what people are talking about in this situation. Sometimes that disparity shrinks to nothing. Sometimes that disparity actually spins the other way. In some cases, there is still a tiny residual, in some cases. But that doesn't necessarily mean that residual must be explained by the sole account of discrimination. There may be an independent variable you haven't controlled for. All that the residual means is that among the independent variables you controlled for, they can't explain the difference by themselves. So he kind of touches on this. This is by the way, this is a major mistake, a statistical misunderstanding that the left have when they perform these sort of when they get into debates in this respect and talk about the research that points their way in this respect. So Sowell actually makes this point on page 181. Like so many studies which hold particular variables constant, this one, which was the Boston Federal Reserve study, seemed to assume that either these were the only variables that mattered, or that any other variables could be assumed to be the same as between blacks and whites, even though every variable actually investigated had turned out to be different between blacks and whites. So that means that when you're performing your independent variable control, some of those independent variables you would expect to not actually have any effect on the outcome. But in the event that every single one of them to that point is having an effect on the outcome and is reducing the size of that residual, you would suspect, it would be reasonable to suspect, that another instance of independent variable control would, like the other independent variables controlled for, would probably have some sort of effect similar to the previous independent variables you've controlled for. So in short, the whole thesis of the chapter is disparity doesn't necessarily mean discrimination, which was also the whole thesis of an entire book that he wrote called Discrimination and Disparities. I'll put a link in this video's description to that series in this channel because I actually read that book on this channel, kind of like we're doing with this series here today. And this was pretty much the entire thesis of Discrimination and Disparities. It goes into much greater detail on the topic, and then on top of that, it does much further debunking from an empirical standpoint of all of these fallacies and all of these misnomers than economic facts and fallacies can do in the 10 to 15 pages of this section. There is a point, too, to be derived from all of this, which is what is discrimination? And when is discrimination just, looking at discriminating between the two qualities of two apples? One apple is overripe, one apple is ripe. So we're going to discriminate against the ripe apples when it comes to eating the overripe apples, when it comes to eating the apples. I'm just going to read a little excerpt from Discrimination and Disparities because this is something that Sowell was touching up on in this read that I think he does a better job of explaining so that the common reader can understand it in Discrimination and Disparities. He breaks up discrimination into three kinds, discrimination 1 and 2, and then he breaks up discrimination 1 into two kinds, discrimination 1A and discrimination 1B. And he explains what that means on page 23 of Discrimination and Disparities. This is still discrimination 1, and he explains what discrimination 1 is, basing decisions on empirical evidence. But the distinction between the ideal version of discrimination 1, which he explains, judging each individual as an individual, and making decisions based on empirical evidence about the group to which the individual belongs, is a consequential difference. So in this case, and then to clarify even further, we can call the ideal version, basing decisions on evidence about individuals, discrimination 1A, and the less than ideal version, basing individual decisions on group evidence, discrimination 1B. But both are different from discrimination 2, making decisions based on unsubstantiated notions or animosities. So basically what he's saying in that section is that there is a difference between, we don't have a way of individualizing this decision making that is in any way reasonable or cost effective, at least. So we're going to make a decision based on evidence that we have about the group rather than evidence we have about the individual. And this isn't an animus about the group. This is just evidence that you have about the group. This is a case of we need more information. And right now, this is the information we have. So we have no way to base our decision on information we don't have. But this is information we do have. So we're going to default to group characteristics in this respect, which we would rather not do, but we kind of have no choice. Our hands are tied in this respect. In this read, Sowell touches up on this, that this isn't necessarily animus against a race. On page 172, he makes this point. So if you just excuse me. Someone with no racial, just as people with racial bias or prejudice may fail to discriminate when the cost of doing so is too high, and this is where he makes this point, someone with no racial antipathy at all may still discriminate based on race if rates of crime, disease, or other undesirable characteristics differ from one racial group to another, and alternative ways of sorting out individuals are more costly or less accurate. Indeed, members of the same group may discriminate against other people like themselves for this reason, as when black taxi drivers avoid picking up black male passengers after dark. And then he concludes, in short, race is used as a sorting device for decision-making, even by people who are not racists. So in a very common example that would be used to kind of debunk basically everything that Sowell is saying in this read, in this chapter, and in Discrimination and Disparities, is the oft-cited study about how job applicants who had the identical job applications and identical resumes, but who changed their names, were being hired at a different rate, and it was resulting in a disparity based on race. Two things to point out about that study that you guys can use in future in future conversations. The first point is less important to this discussion that we're having today, but one, the black names that they were associating with black people that were causing this disparity were names like that were absolutely absurd, like Deshonda or something like that, or Laquifa, or Ladasha, the famous LA-A Ladasha name. The equivalent that they were using for whites was like Michael, was like James, was like Thomas. What they should have been using to get basically the equivalent, basically what we're doing is we're taking white trash names as our equivalent to convey the point, would be names like Cletus McGillicuddy. And these are not names that they were doing. And what they were, if you actually isolate names like Michael Taylor, which could go one way or the other, right? If you actually took the black names that were like Michael Taylor, you found that they were hired at exactly the same rate. The other flaw of the study is that the disparity that you saw with the male black applicants and the white male black applicants did not exist at nearly the same scale with the female applicants, which suggests that even when they're seeing the names and are able to say maybe this person is black, there is something beyond the fact that they are black that is causing the discernment if that is the case. Now, there are other independent variables that they didn't control for well that we can go into an entire video on debunking that entire test and that entire study. But if it was a purely racial animus, even if it was a deep-seated racial animus that we could somehow not possibly identify, measure, test, or see, then you would expect the same thing to happen in women and at an identical rate. And it wasn't happening. So Shamiqua was getting hired was getting hired significantly more often or discriminated against, and I use air quotes for that, less often than Jamal. And in this case, I'm just using Jamal because I'm trying to think of a ridiculous black name, like something out when the names are being taken out of a Key and Peele skit. Then the merits of the study are something for which I have a little less sympathy. So the other thing to point out here is that in this read, when we're talking about the types of discrimination, when we're talking about debunking the existence thereof, there are places, of course, where it actually exists. And of course, there are places where it actually exists. There's basically no way to force it out of a group of people. These racial animosities derive from something that is much deeper seated than any governmental policy could actually handle. So the question here then becomes, if Sowell is kind of, the claim is that Sowell is implying a vision of a very extremely free market where racists are allowed to be racist, the obvious question to follow up on that with is, what happens when you allow racists to be racist? Well, there's a price that they're going to have to pay for their discrimination. And this is a very important point to bring up, which Sowell brings up on page 170. What is overlooked in such fallacious assumptions is the price that has to be paid by someone who turns his subjective feelings into an overt act. What does that mean? That means that these businesses that are actually being racist, without any other deciding factors, without any other free speech movement that says this guy is a racist jerk, don't buy from him, without any boycotting processes, by hiring people who are less qualified to perform the work, you've actually created a competitive disadvantage for yourself. And what that means is that those businesses are going to be operating because there's 330 million people in this country. If you have any business that is operating in that manner, it is of course going to exist in a competitive market. Again, assuming that there is a competitive market and there isn't some sort of governmental practice which is precluding a competitive market, then what they're going to have to do is compete with the companies that don't discriminate. And what that means is that there's going to be less equity returned to the owners. That's less net profit, less net income for those business owners, which means that they will either be, at best, forced to the fringe while somebody else completely dominates the market, or they'll be forced completely out of business in totality. It also means that they're going to have a hell of a time getting lending. It also means they're going to have a hell of a time getting investment because investors and loan officers are making they're making an investment based on a purely actuarial decision. Will you make us money? And in this case, the business that refuses to hire people based solely on race and not in any way based on merit, those are the businesses that are going to have the lowest returns. Those are the businesses where the investors are going to say, wow, I'd rather have my money in this other company that doesn't discriminate based on race. Which means that, again, these people are going to be either forced to the fringe or completely shut out of business. The follow-up question, of course, to that is, and I'll try to be brief, something that Sowell points out on page 171. Do the costs of discrimination actually change behavior in the real world? Hard evidence indicates that it does. And this is actually true. There's been a lot of psychological studies done about all of this, and it relates directly to the psychological studies that have been done about addiction. You can't pull a gun to somebody's head and change their deep-seated fundamental underlying beliefs. You can make them change their actions, but if you just put a gun to somebody's head, like somebody who's an addict, if you just put a gun to an addict's head, that won't make them less of an addict. What that will make them they'll hold an animosity towards you that will just make them bitter. They will just make them resent the reason that they are no longer discriminating. So in this case, what you would prefer to have is to weed out the actual racism itself, which means that when they are confronted with the realities of their own racism, when they are forced to admit to their own reality, not by gun, when they are forced to see their own consequences by their own actions, then they are forced with the decision to die or change their behavior. Change their behavior or they're going to die. And this is the exact same decision-making process that happens with addiction. You can't force an addict to not be an addict. An addict has to be let and has to be allowed to decide for themselves to make this decision. This is something that's commonly known in the world of psychology, that when addicts overcome their addiction, let's say, one of the first things they'll tell you is that, number one, they had to reach rock bottom. So a racist, when they're exhibiting racist hiring practices in the workplace, they have to be allowed to hit rock bottom. They can't have a safety net, right, which is the gun to their head. They were forced to reach rock bottom, and it allowed them to come out of denial, because that's the first step in recovery. It allowed them to come out of denial and realize what they were doing. And here's the important lesson. They didn't kick the habit because of their kids. They didn't kick the habit because of their wife. They didn't kick the habit because of their job. They kicked the habit for themselves. They have to be self-interested in order to kick that habit. They have to come to grips with their own. They have to experience the cognitive dissonance. And if they don't experience the cognitive dissonance, they will never change their minds. So it's the shortest version I can possibly give on that respect. So not only does he do the debunking of the common claims, he also points out that there's a misunderstanding of the notion of discrimination, and most importantly, that the resolution to racism causing discrimination isn't putting a gun to somebody's head. It's allowing them to see the fallacies of their own. They have to hit rock bottom. It's basically forcing them to starve or change their positions. As a quick aside, just to close the analysis and review part of this video, I'm not going to suggest that he actually gets this wrong, but on pages 173 and 170, and kind of into page 174, he seems to be making, I'm using the word seems, I'm not saying he is, but there seems to be a misunderstanding that he's making of overall public spending in public education, K through 12, and educational outcomes. And I'll make the statement and I'll read the excerpt here. There is no correlation. This is actually something that I've researched, gone through enormous effort to research, and is something that's extremely well documented. There is no correlation between overall spending on public education, K through 12, and educational outcomes. And if anything, that correlation is negative. So this is why I'm saying this. It's because he says on page 173, in a later era, after such disparities in per pupil expenditures, in some parts of the South, per pupil expenditure was several times as high for white students as for black students. And he seems to conclude, in a later era, after such disparities in per pupil expenditures in the days of school attendance were either less or non-existent, the academic performances of the students themselves differed so much that, as already noted, an average black 17-year-old scored at a level achieved by white students who were years younger. What that means is that even after you adjust for the per pupil expenditures, there's still a huge disparity. So he seems to be implying in the first instance that one of the causes for this disparity in educational outcomes is the per pupil expenditures. I don't know if that's his actual position, especially given that this book was written. This book was last updated in 2008. So it's been 13 years. And Sowell is somebody who, with something like that, I think could be convinced of the fact that, and when it comes to overall spending on public education, there is no correlation between it and educational outcomes. Just as a quick plug, if you guys are interested in that topic, I did a video on my other channel. It is entitled The Truth About Spending in Public Schools, What Works and What Doesn't. I'll put a link to that in this video's description. So do check that out, because I went through a lot of effort in researching that topic and editing that video. So it's something that I think you guys will really like. So that's it for today. In our next read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, we will conclude Chapter 6. And the conclusion for Chapter 6 which is our final read. It shall be a very short read. Is the section entitled Summary and Implications. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.